So welcome to another episode of the Jobs for Women podcast. I'm really excited to welcome our guest, Lizzie Martin, who is head of coaching and the founder of Work Life Mother. Welcome to the podcast, Lizzie.
Thank you so much for having me, Zoe.
It's so great to connect with you. And we have already had a long chat, and we could have just talked for hours, couldn't we, about everything to do with being a mum in the workplace. So it's great that you're on the podcast today to share your wisdom and insights, because obviously at Jobs for Women, we are talking about everything that women have going on at work, the barriers, what we're up against, gender discrimination, pay gap, you name it. So it's kind of like, I think when we're thinking about being a working mother, it's so important to have these conversations with, and whatever stage, whoever's listening, if you're in the early stages of your career or whatever stage, it's kind of like knowledge is power, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I always hear people say to me is like, no one ever talks about this stuff enough.
Exactly. Because there isn't a manual, there is no guide, is there? No. And I think as well, this is where the emphasis and the onus comes on the organizations to have a system in place. So can you, I mean, I've just dived straight in, haven't I? Can you tell us a little bit about what's your background? How did you get into this? What's the story?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you the kind of like top line story. Otherwise we'll be here for more than just hours, days perhaps. So as Zoe said, so I'm Lizzie Martin and I'm head of coaching, and I founded Work Life Mother 6 years ago. So my first career was 10 years of management and leadership for John Lewis. So I spent 5 years with John Lewis, 5 years with Waitrose. And I went on my first maternity leave, and it was during my maternity leave that I saw how challenging it was for new parents. And that's not just the first time they have a child, but it's sort of second, third, subsequent time they have a child, to successfully navigate life as a new parent, but also continue to progress and realize career ambitions kind of in the workplace. I think I probably deep down had heard, the odd story from people that it's difficult to do both. But I was really brought up with the narrative that you have to choose between one or the other. So what are you going to choose to do? Are you going to choose to work full time? Are you going to choose to be a mum? And there was very much this kind of either or mentality. But I was already coaching at work and I was on maternity leave, and I thought, do you know what? I've got this entrepreneurial bug, this kind of fire in my tummy. It had been there the whole time. I remember at university Googling buy a franchise because I really knew I wanted to do something. I just didn't know what that thing was. And I just thought to myself, look, I can have so much more impact if I'm working outside of kind of the corporate space, working with these individuals, helping them to manage those competing demands of new motherhood, parenting, but also career ambition, and to help them return back to work with energy, with focus, and not have to pick between one or the other. So I started coaching individuals, and I did that for a couple of years. I've got 2 daughters. At the time, they were quite young, so I was managing the juggle myself. And then after a few years of working directly with individuals, I got more and more requests from the corporate space, from employers saying, do you know what, we would really like to offer this support to our employees because we want to keep hold of our talent. We don't want to see these brilliant women leaving the workforce on their maternity leave or shortly after. So can you help us as well?
That is so refreshing, because when I think back to when I was on mat leave, the support was lacking, let's just say. So that's great to hear that companies are actually reaching out and recognizing the need for it. I think that's so interesting what you just said then about the choice, because if I am truly honest, I think whether societal, what I've been told, or over the years what I presumed I would have to, wherever those thoughts came from, I was of that understanding. well, I can't. I worked in London, crazy busy job, lots of hours, and I just didn't think I could have both. So I think just going back to that, is that what comes up a lot? You know, when you, I know you're doing more coaching now in the corporate world, but when you were doing the one-to-one coaching, was that something that came up a lot with your clients?
Yeah, and it still comes up. It still comes up with my clients. You know, whether I'm working with them directly or whether they're, you know, the coaching's being paid for by their employer, it still comes up. So I think there's that tension between. I think it's about how do you allocate your time. You know, I think a lot of people struggle with that. And I think the other thing is that if an individual does want to do both, they feel guilty for it. Like, am I greedy for wanting to do both? Because this narrative around you had to choose between one or the other, it almost says you can't, you know, you can't have both. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, actually, who says that? Who makes up the rules? I want to be able to have both. That in itself is a massive barrier, isn't it? Or a massive hurdle that needs to be overcome. And I think, as you said earlier, because there isn't a handbook, because there is no right or wrong, I think so many individuals will constantly be picking apart their decision making and questioning whether they're making the right choices. And that's really a really common source of a lot of that pressure, which is, am I doing the right thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And because of COVID as well, I was reading a report recently about the whole flexible working thing. Because when I think back to my experience of it, I remember working in an organization, and there was an amazing, you know, employee, and she'd come back from a second mat leave and had asked to do the nursery pickup to leave 15 minutes early. And I remember it was like rejected. And I was like, and I know this was I know organizations are getting a little bit more aware of flexible working, but back in the day, it was kind of like you put this formal request in, didn't you, to have flexible working? And a lot of, in this report, I read that, you know, women didn't, and men, but were focusing on women today, didn't want to, you know, put the request in for fear of their career trajectory or future promotions, seen to be, you know, wanting flexible work. And I remember thinking, well, how the hell is she going to pick a kid up? Like, this is, let's just look at this on a basic level. If a husband or partner or whoever can't, and she's just asking for 15 minutes early. And I remember at the time thinking, well, there's no way, how I won't be able to do that then. It's kind of like seeing other people's experiences. Do you think organizations are being more open to, you know, like when you're working with them, is that something that you talk about? Do you get into that detail about flexible working?
Yeah, I think what's interesting here about the organisations that I work with is that, first of all, not every single organisation is queuing up, knocking on my door saying, hey, Lizzie, we want to give more support to our women coming back from mat leave. You know, I would love that to be the reality, but it isn't. You know, there are still quite a lot of dinosaur organisations out there who don't think that this is an area that needs attention, focus, or support. So when I am working with an organisation, generally they share common characteristics, and that is that they care about their people, they're progressive and forward thinking, and they want to do the right thing. So this isn't just a tick box exercise. So normally the point at which I start working with an organisation, they've already got a good solid culture in place. They're already really progressive in their thinking around flexible working. I think the barrier that I see a lot in organisations is, where does flexible working sit? Does it sit in policy, or does it sit with line manager discretion? And what happens quite often is organisations will say, we'll leave it to the discretion of the line manager, and then line managers are worried that if they say yes to Sally, they're going to have to say yes to every single other person on the team, and they haven't been trained well to deal with things like flexible working requests. So sometimes that can be where the barrier is. It's not that the policy says no, or it might be that the policy says no, but quite often it's down to that line manager conversation, and whether that manager feels confident and supported in the organisation to say, do you know what, I actually really understand what this individual's going through, and this isn't going to be forever, and it is just 15 minutes, so I'm going to say yes, and I feel quite comfortable saying yes to Sally for this situation, because I know for somebody else they'll want flexible working for a different reason. And it's not just, flexible working isn't something that's just for working mums. This is for everybody to be able to have a life outside of work. So it's, to answer your question quickly, the organizations that I work with generally have quite a good working culture. But I think that there's still so much more that can be done specifically around these flexible working conversations.
Yeah. And I remember when I think we talked about this when we had our chat off the pod. I spoke to a global company that had recognized the importance of looking after this demographic, or this, that stage of your life when you're returning to the workplace. Often, depending on what birth and experience you've gone through, as sometimes a different person, and they were seeing a high percentage of women dropping from full-time to part-time and then leaving entirely. And we know that this is costing companies loads of money. So what I wanted to really delve into is, which I love, on your website, you talk about these transition stages, well, the 3 stages before, when you're pregnant, going through, whatever you're working with, and then when you're off, and then coming back to work. So what advice would you give? So if there's anyone listening that is pregnant, what can they do to make that process as smooth as possible? How can they empower themselves or get the most out of when they go off to have their baby?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to talk just about that beginning bit, or just talk more broadly about all 3?
You go for it. You just go broad. Yeah, whatever.
So I think there's a combination of things here. I think there are things that you can do, and it's very easy for somebody to say, here's a checklist of things that you need to be doing. But I think you also need to be thinking about your mindset and your perspective. And something that I say, and this is probably my number one piece of advice, which is to really step into the driving seat of your career at this point in time. So this is about being proactive. This is about recognizing that challenges might exist. We know that the system isn't currently set up for us to succeed as working mothers, but it's to make sure that you don't slip into that sort of I've got a chip on my shoulder victim mindset, because that is going to make a massive difference to your experience. So I always talk about taking responsibility at this point in time and not waiting for somebody to do it for you. So it's really easy, particularly if you've had a career that has been kind of managed for you. Maybe you started in an organization, maybe you were on a scheme such as a graduate scheme where there was an element of career management done on your behalf. This is the time to take back all of that control and say, look, I'm going to really proactively manage the next chapter or chapters of my career. So I would say that really is the foundation for the transition, is to make sure that you're taking ownership for that. And then there's so much that you can be doing at each of the points in time. And when we work with individuals that we coach through Work Life Mother, we break that down into 3 main pillars, and it's the 3 C's. So we talk about career, we talk about confidence, and we talk about communication. And what we mean by this is, if you are going to manage these transitions well, you need to be thinking about how you are taking that ownership for your career development. So making sure that you are aware of where you sit with your kind of performance reviews, making sure that you are managing development yourself, making sure you're able to articulate what your skills and your strengths are. So very much thinking about longer term career progression. Then we talk about connection. And this is probably I think this is one of the areas that gets overlooked the most, particularly before somebody goes on leave, which is having a plan for how you are going to stay connected with your company. So how do you want your organization to contact you whilst you're on leave? Is that email? Is that WhatsApp? Is that once a month? Is it nothing for the first 4 months? So that sort of that ability to be connected to your organization but also connected to your team is so critical for your longer term development, because we don't want you to slip into kind of being out of sight, out of mind, which can happen. You know, if you're not visible because you're not physically there, how are you going to maintain those kind of relationships and that connection? And then the third thing is about confidence. So one of the biggest barriers to coming back to work after mat leave, being able to thrive in your role, is that dip in confidence. So it's thinking about how can you set yourself up to feel confident, to surround yourself with the right kinds of people that feed into that, and look after your well-being, because that directly correlates with confidence. You know, when I work with people that are struggling with their confidence, it's normally because they haven't eaten a proper meal for a few days. It's 4 p.m. and they've only just remembered that they haven't brushed their teeth in the morning. Dehydration, you know, an exercise that isn't just lifting your baby in and out of the car and the pram and cleaning the floor. So those are the 3 pillars that we work towards. So career, confidence and connection, and it breaks down into much more practical actions at each of the points in time. But basically, if you think about those 3 things, then you're not going to go far wrong.
That's brilliant. You know, when we're thinking about the connection piece, obviously we're all different, aren't we? And you know, like when you said, you know, it could be, what does it look like? Is it WhatsApp? Is it email? Is it once a month? Is it more that you're sort of telling people to own and set your own boundary? So it's kind of like you're not saying, hey, you still need to be contactable if you don't want to be. It's like having that open dialogue with your manager, isn't it? So they know then when to contact you. It's not you saying you need to make sure that you're being contacted or available.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it's everything from like the detail of like, how do you want to share the news that your baby has arrived? You know, who do you want to send a picture in? Do you want that picture to be shared around the office? Do you not want that to be shared around the office? You know, there have been horror stories, haven't there, where somebody shared a WhatsApp picture with their colleague and they've just given birth and they've got a baby and you can see their nipple because they're feeding their baby, and then that gets shared on a work WhatsApp group. So yeah, absolutely, it's having those boundaries in place. But also, anybody that's going on maternity leave or parental leave also has keeping in touch days. So you'll have 10 keeping in touch days that you get paid for, that you can use during the later stages of your maternity leave to keep in touch, to strengthen those communication channels, to kind of aid that phased transition back to work. And they are just so underutilized. And I just really think that if you can put a plan in place, just a loose one, just pencil some things in before you go on your maternity leave, then you're working towards something. You're not going to be forgotten about or missed out on various pieces of communication if you take that proactive approach.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing you say as well is this is a two-way thing. This is like not just relying on your line manager. Because often, again, it's like an education piece, isn't it? If your line manager isn't trained or hasn't managed someone that's gone off on mat leave, then they might feel like they're encroaching on your personal space. But if you do that work, that piece of work before, like you're showing willing and also just empowering yourself in knowing how many kit days, when you can take them. And I feel like when I think back, I just think I was just floating along, going with the flow. And I think the organization that I worked for maybe didn't have the knowledge either. I mean, my line manager was great when I went off, but when I think now, I think the process would have been a lot more smoother, and I'd have probably felt a bit more supported and happier if I'd have taken a bit of ownership. So that makes absolute sense. And you don't always think about it like that, do you?
I also think that even if you have got a line manager who maybe has gone through it themselves, is just to make sure that you don't assume they know what they're doing either, because they might have thought, actually, I don't really want to use my keeping in touch days. So I think a common assumption that is made quite often, very often, is that because someone else has also been through what we're going through, they're going to completely understand what we need, and therefore they're going to give us what we need. So I think it's very much about knowing what you need and going and asking for it, but it's about organizations making it safe for you to ask for it. So when we talk about the confidence pillar in the context of organizations, I train managers on this concept of psychological safety, which links back to what you were saying about flexible working. Can your returners confidently ask for what they need without worrying that there's going to be a negative repercussion? So can they ask for their keeping in touch days? Do they know how to ask for keeping in touch days? Do they feel safe enough to say that they're leaving at 4, or they want to leave at 4 to pick up their child from nursery? Or are they putting a calendar event in saying client meeting, and concealing what they're actually doing because they don't feel as though they can be authentically themselves at work? So I do think it's about being proactive and asking for what you need, but I don't think it needs to solely sit on the shoulders of the individual. I think this is absolutely something that needs to be shared ownership by the organisation as well.
It's kind of a no-brainer, when you think about how much it costs to recruit a member of staff, and when we've got the gender pay gap staring us in the face, amazing talent that are leaving, all of that experience that they've got, it's kind of like a no-brainer to me for an organization to really focus on this as a priority and not just like a nice added extra, because 51% of the population, if we choose to have kids, that's a lot of people going on mat leave and having babies. So I'm glad that you're working with organizations, but to go back to your point earlier that they're not beating the door down, we need to kind of get that message out, don't we?
Yeah.
A little bit more. And so a woman has hopefully worked with their employer and then they're on mat leave, maybe doing keeping in touch days. What about the return? Because for me, my experience, I quit. I left London. I was ill. I had postnatal depression, but I literally couldn't, and I still can't. When I think back, I can see why I couldn't envisage myself doing that job, especially seeing that flexible working to pick up a child 50 minutes early. I couldn't do it. So yeah, there were other reasons why I left, but in essence, I quit. So how can women feel empowered? What do you do with women to make that return as seamless as possible so that they can thrive and they can, go off and have the career that they so desire?
Yeah. So the first thing that I always do with everybody that I work with is get really clear on like, what does good look like? So what does going back to work and thriving, what does that actually mean? Because when we use certain words like going back to work and feeling confident or going back to work and thriving, we all have a different mental image of what that looks like. So for me, the most important thing is to get clear on what that is, but also to make sure that every individual is true to that image and it's not something that they've been told they should be doing. So we can be influenced quite heavily by a sister or a mother or a boss or a husband that might be saying like, this is what you should be doing. So the most important thing for me is to get crystal clear on that to start with, because anybody who's forcing it and is going back to go and do something that really isn't shaped around what they want their future to look like, it's really just going to delay the inevitable, which is, burnout or a complete car crash when it comes to career fulfillment. So that often means that we sort of get the microscope out and we have a look at priorities, we have a look at values, we get really clear on, okay, what's motivating you, what's important to you, and then that really sets the foundation for building everything on top of that. The pretty much universal theme that comes up with individuals going back to work at this point in time is around having a look at the amount of workload, mental workload, cognitive labor that the individual is that's got on their to-do list that's currently taking on. So there's always a really big conversation around what do you now need to stop doing so that you can effectively go back to work. So on maternity leave, women often become the expert at caring for their little one. They often also become the expert at all of the household chores and labor, and this is really a transition that requires putting down some of those activities, delegating them out to other people, which can be incredibly challenging, because letting go of control and allowing other people to do things as well as we can do is really, really challenging. But if that doesn't take place, then what happens is women will go back to work. They'll be carrying that full-time job of looking after the little one, thinking about everything to do with caring for their baby, as well as now trying to fit in the energy and the time to do their job. So any transition requires that combination of looking forwards, but also setting down things that might have been done in the past. And this is where it's so critical that if you do have a partner, you think about working as a team and what does this mean for them? So if you're going back to work, what does this now mean for your partner? How is their daily routine going to change? What are they going to be picking up in order for you to be able to go back to work and thrive?
I've just had one of those light bulb moments. Like, that makes absolute sense, doesn't it? And sometimes you don't even know you're doing all of these tasks. So to actually pause and be like, okay, what do I need to drop or pass over in order to go back to work? Because we cannot do it all, can we? And I never ever did that when I went back to work. It was just kind of keep going. And we do take on, it's interesting. Then you're on technically off work, but you are raising a human, you might have other children as well, and then take on more of the household duties. And let's not lie, the admin, I was chatting to someone the other day about the admin of life. Running a household is like a full-time job, just with the admin of where people need to be. But that piece in itself has been a bit of a light bulb for me, because to return to work and to be happy and to thrive, whatever thrive is for you, is so important to actually reflect on what you've got going on currently. And having that open dialogue with your partner. And do you find, I mean, you might not know off the top of your head, but is it common for women that were full-time to go back full-time and then drop their hours because maybe they're not doing that work that we've just talked about, looking at the load that they have on, and then get back to work and think, I can't do this. How am I going to do that? Is that common? Have you found that?
Yeah, I see that. That's quite common. I also see a lot of women going back to work and they have negotiated some flexible working. So maybe they've negotiated working 20% less hours. So they might be saying, I'm going back to work and I'm so lucky. I'm going to be working 4 days a week. Right. So there's this like real gratitude that they're able to work 4 days a week, and they're taking a 20% pay cut. And the thing that I see happening, and I don't mean to smile and laugh, but I suppose it's the fact that this still exists that frustrates me, is that those women are grateful that they've been allowed to get paid 20% less and theoretically work 1 day less, but they don't, because there isn't a change in their job scope. So actually what they end up doing is squeezing 100% of their work deliverables into, they don't squeeze it into 80% of time. They still deliver probably 100% of the time, but now they're just being paid 20% less. And that is then driving that gender pay gap even further. So if women are coming back to work on less than full-time hours, it's so critical that the job scope is also rescoped to make sure that the outputs have been recalibrated. So women aren't doing the same amount of work and being paid less.
And let's face it, most of the time the job specs are not being redone, are they? I had a friend in London that did exactly what you said. She dropped to 4 days. She was working for a big film company. And then I saw her a few months later and she was like, Zoe, I've gone back to full time because I was getting paid. And exactly what you said. And it's frustrating that, and then we try to do, when you look at it, it's like, why are we dropping this day to spend time and look after and raise our child. And it's like that, like this constant balance. I mean, we could talk about this all day. I know we've got to wrap up soon. Do you feel like women have a pressure? Because I've talked to my friends about this before. The pressure, we're sort of seen to be judged whether we decide to be a stay-at-home mum, whether we go back part-time. If we're full-time, it's like, oh, they're not at the school gates picking the kid up. Do you feel like there's this pressure, and is it ever going to go away on women, working women, or choosing to not work?
It's that I wish I had a crystal ball and I could see into the future. I hope it goes away. I think for me, I think the pressure exists, right? And we get to choose how we want to respond to that. And within the coaching world, we'll always talk about you can react or you can respond, right? And responding to something is a much more powerful place to be. So this is about acknowledging that pressures exist and we feel guilty, right? And we talk about mum guilt. I wish we spoke about dad guilt or parental guilt. Let's not label it purely as a mum thing. But if you can get to really know what's important to you and you can trust your decisions, and this is the key, if you can trust your decisions, then you can minimize that guilt and you can minimize that pressure. Now, I don't think it's necessarily going to completely go away, but this is about making sure that it doesn't then control your life. So it's about managing it. So every now and again, the pressure and the guilt is really helpful because it's telling us something. It's, you know, it's a red flag, isn't it? It's a red flag saying, hang on a second, maybe it's time to put your phone down and be present whilst you're bathing your children, because actually you didn't hear what they just said. And it's really important that you're a present parent. So sometimes it needs to be listened to, and you might need to take action as a result of that pressure and that guilt that you're feeling. But really, you know, I would love to see women getting to a place where they've got that trust in their decision making, and they know that what they're doing is the right thing for them, the right thing for them as a family unit, and therefore the right thing for their children, because they've done that work and they've really established those priorities.
Yeah, I love that. It's like a separate piece of, well, inner work. We all need to do it, and with all the facets in life, don't you think? I've got an expert that we're recording on confidence and, you know, like the inner dialogue, and I love that. I love your answer about being okay with your decision and kind of owning it. And, you know, and every family is different. Everyone has different circumstances and needs. So I know I keep saying we need to wrap up. We do need to wrap up. Workplaces. So to finish, if there's a woman listening that is sort of either thinking about having kids or she's already on mat leave or going back, are there any tips if they're working for an organization that isn't open about this kind of stuff, isn't really having these conversations about kit days, or is there any top advice, any top tips that they could do now, just to put you on the spot, just go and strengthen your network. So go and have a conversation with somebody that you see as a bit of a role model, maybe somebody who's 3 or 4 years ahead of where you are currently, and go and start building those relationships, because that is going to be so valuable. So having those connections, having those role models, but also having that kind of that ally and that mentor in your back pocket is going to set you up for so much success further in the future. So I would say invest in the relationships. That's something that you can control. So you might be frustrated that your policy isn't great. You might be able to influence that, but what you can really control are those relationships and those conversations that you're having. So I would say it's never too early to be developing those connections. And that connections within the organization where they're working?
Yeah, or within the industry.
Great advice. Yeah, this is when we launch our membership at Jobs for Women. I want this mentorship and this connection, networking to be such a huge part of it, because it is so powerful. Like you say, that's really good advice. So that brings us to the end. I feel like we've literally been recording 5 minutes. Thank you for joining us. You are coming back, aren't you, to record a masterclass for the Jobs for Women membership platform, and I'm so excited for that. And thank you for coming on to share your wisdom and expertise. If people want to reach out to you, connect with you, do coaching with you, what's the best way for them to connect?
So you can find me on all the kind of obvious social media platforms. That sounds a bit cheesy, doesn't it? You can't actually find me on all of them. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Lizzie Martin PCC on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram, so I'm at Work Life Mother, or you can head over to my website, which is worklifemother.com.
And I'll put all the details in the show notes. And Lizzie will be back, like I say, with a masterclass. We're going to have loads going on for that. So make sure that you are on the list to join when we launch. Thank you so much, Lizzie. Always a pleasure. And we will see you very soon.
Thanks so much.